Okay, well, it's 12:05. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director of the UC Center Sacramento, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our weekly speaker series. Um, by way of announcements, I would remind everyone that we do have a full summer program that may be of special interest to the education community, including a discussion next week with Cal State University Chancellor Joseph Castro. So we hope to see many of you there. We're honored today to have Dean Louie Rodriguez from UC Riverside here to speak, and doubly honored to have Assembly Member Jose Medina here to introduce him. Assembly Member Medina was elected in 2012 to represent California's 61st district, which includes Moreno Valley, Paris, Mead Valley, and of course, the city of Riverside and the UC Riverside campus. Mr. Medina is an experienced educator, having spent 35 years as a high school teacher in history and social studies with the Riverside School District. Prior to his election to the State Assembly, he served as a school board member and a member of the Riverside Community College District Board of Trustees. And while a trustee, he focused on job training, upgrading classrooms and science labs, and expanding curricular offerings. A proud Highlander, he earned a bachelor's degree in Latin American Studies and a master's in history at UC Riverside. He's the recipient of many awards and fellowships and is currently the chair of the Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy Committee, and a member of the Committees of Accountability and Administrative Review, Governmental Organization, and Higher Education within the Assembly. So it gives me great pleasure to turn the program over to Assembly Member Medina, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, for that very warm welcome. And as was mentioned, I'm Assembly Member Jose Medina, representing the 61st Assembly District and the Chair of Higher Education. But most importantly, a fellow UCR alum. And so because of that, I'm very honored to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Louie Rodriguez. Dean Rodriguez is currently the interim dean, professor, and holds the Bank of America Chair in Educational Leadership, Policy, and Practice in the Graduate School of Education at UC Riverside. He's also the founding director of the Center for Educational Transformation at UC Riverside. His credentials and accomplishments are extensive. His research centers on urban schooling and focuses on student voices and experiences in school and community, and critical ways to understand and use school culture to boost student engagement. He has led several research initiatives, including the Practice Project, a school community-based initiative aimed at understanding student engagement and disengagement from the student perspective. He also developed a 10-point plan and published his book, The Time Is Now, Understanding and Responding to the Black, Latino, Latina Dropout Crisis in the United States. Over the last several years, he's also spent time collaborating with schools and districts to implement many of the lessons learned from his research. And I would add that I had the opportunity and honor to have him speak at my own school, Poly High School, a few years back. Today, we are here to discuss the very important topic of representation of Latino students in our classrooms, our faculty, educators, and curriculum. Indeed, Dean Rodriguez's mission reflects the kind of work that we wish as a state our educational system should accomplish. The importance of ethnic studies in our curriculum, making students of color feel represented, seen, and heard in the classroom. Why leadership like Dean Rodriguez is so critical at this time. I look forward to his ongoing work and to the lively discussion today. It is my honor to introduce Dean Rodriguez.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member, for that introduction. And thank you for continuing to be a champion and advocate for education across the state and our region. Dr. Kravitz, thank you for the invitation and all of the staff members who made this opportunity possible. I know there's a lot of work that goes into these events, and I'm always grateful for the staff members who who do a lot of the work behind the scenes to make all of this go seamlessly. Well, thank you so much, guests and all of you attending this webinar, students, faculty, staff across the system. It's an honor, and I'm appreciative of, I see a couple of our GSOE faculty members, Dr. Echeverria and Dr. Ng at UC Riverside. I see a couple of names that might be some of our former students. So it's great to see everyone here today. And I thank you so much. I'm going to start my presentation now. Okay. So the title of my presentation is Looking into the Institutional Mirror, Ways to Promote Validating Practices and Policies in Education for Latinx students. As Assembly Member mentioned, I am the interim dean and professor at UC Riverside Graduate School of Education, and I am honored to be here. A couple of things I'd like to start off with is, thinking about a few things. I'm going to talk about a couple of metaphors. Obviously, in the title of my presentation, the mirror as the metaphor. The mirror as a metaphor for education, our educational system, educational opportunities. So think about that as I present today. The other metaphor I'm going to talk about is the backpack. We know that our students bring a backpack to school every new school year, and they're excited with their new glue sticks, their new scissors, their spiral notebooks and pencils. But I would argue that our students are bringing a lot more to education. They're bringing a lot more in their backpacks to education. And what I'm hoping to do today is how can, kind of talk a little bit about the ways in which we can recognize a lot more that they bring in those backpacks. I'd like to talk a little bit about my own journey. I am a proud product of the Inland Empire community. I'm a proud product of the public school system. And here's that backpack I was talking about. You think about a kid who's 4 or 5 years old, they're starting off in kindergarten, and they have that backpack full of supplies, but full of a lot of other things that I like to validate today. For me personally, education is that vehicle. It is that vehicle to see opportunities, see possibility. And if you look at my resume, you'll see that I'm a product of those public schools. I'm a proud transfer student after attending San Bernardino Valley College. I'm a proud product of the California State University system. I'm a proud McNair Scholar who introduced me to a research opportunity at Harvard while I was an undergrad, where later I completed my graduate school. I started off my academic career on the East Coast in Florida and eventually made it back to my alma mater, Cal State San Bernardino, to become a professor, and eventually landed where I am now at UC Riverside just a little over 5 years ago. But this is all information you would see on a resume. You can just Google me, find my resume and say, yeah, Louie went to all of these institutions. But this is just part of my story. What you don't see is my family. And that's what I bring in my backpack. And that's what many of our students bring in their backpack. They bring their family. They bring their community. I was born in San Bernardino. Here's the Santa Fe whistle that you'll see on 5th and Mount Vernon. I'm proud of that community. I was raised in Colton, right down the street from UC Riverside. I am proud of my mentors. I am here because of other people who mentored me along the way. Here's my mentor, Laura Gomez, who was spent over 35 years at San Bernardino Valley College as a counselor, and she put me on the pathway to transfer. I'm proud of my culture, my language, and my historical legacy of the Chicano community in San Bernardino, Colton, and the Inland Empire community. Here's a cutout of El Chicano newspaper from 1982. And in this image here, you'll see Cesar Chavez, Cruz Reynoso, who just passed, and my aunt Bernie. And she's being honored with these two giants at this event in San Bernardino for her community work. And I later found out, I was only a child at the time, but I later found out she was a huge community advocate for the Mexican-American community on the west side of San Bernardino when they couldn't get access to basic needs like having their trash picked up and having sidewalks built in their community. And I later found out she was a huge champion for advocating for these kinds of things in the Mexican-American community. And I say this because I am proud of her, and she made it possible for me to attend these institutions, for me to sit here today and give a statewide presentation at UC Sacramento. And it's because of people like these two giants that are sitting next to my aunt, and people like my Aunt Bernie, who made it possible. So to circle back to this metaphor of the backpack, our students every day, our 4, 5, 6-year-old students, and traveling all the way through the educational pipeline, they're bringing their families, they're bringing their culture, their community, their ancestors, their language, and many other gifts, their people, to the education space. So with that, I ask a question in my own academic work. How can education be leveraged to transform the life trajectories of our students, of our young people, especially Latino students and other youth of color in our public school system? To kind of frame this conversation, I like to think about what we're denouncing and announcing. And Paulo Freire, the late Brazilian philosopher and educator, talked about the importance of, he says, before you announce something, you should denounce. And so I'm denouncing this notion of blaming and othering that we often see in the media, deficit perspectives towards certain communities, this culture of low expectations or overemphasis on testing, or this notion that poverty and race are deterministic, or this notion that our public schools or institutions are failing. And what I'm really saying is, I'm actually announcing that, teachers, mentors, and role models matter, and we need to invest there. Our community cultural wealth matters. Recognizing the holistic presence of our student matters. Students' voices and experiences matter and should inform what we do in policy and practice. Leadership, policy, and practice matters. And equity and matters of social justice must be deliberate and intentional. So going back to this metaphor of the mirror, how can educators, how can policymakers, how can leaders use the mirror as a tool to engage with our students, families, and communities as a way to gauge how are we doing? How relevant is our policy? How relevant are our practices to serve our communities? And so that's the big question mark that I'm using today, in that, can this student see themselves in that institutional mirror? When they look at school, do they see themselves reflected? Do they see themselves, as the assembly member mentioned, do they see themselves reflected in the curriculum, reflected in their teachers, reflected in the artwork that's on the walls, right? Do they see themselves reflected in this space called education? I would argue that education should be about students seeing their brilliance. They should see their own brilliance, that of their families and communities, their history and their ancestors. But there's this smoke. There's this smoke that's preventing them from seeing themselves clearly, from seeing their brilliance. Sometimes they might even get a distorted view of who they are because of that smoke. And what I'm arguing is that smoke is actually made up of historical injustices, cultural erasure in the curriculum, racism, discrimination and exclusion, this overemphasis on testing and low expectations, zero tolerance policies, silencing of students, deficit thinking. A lot of these matters that we know are counterproductive to education. We see a shortage of teachers and mentors of color, underemphasis of relationships. And so I'm hoping that with this presentation and with some of the research that I've been doing is to clear that smoke. And I'm going to circle back to that point a little later about ways that we could actually, policies and practices that we could adopt to clear that smoke so our students can indeed see their brilliance when they go to school. Some of my early work that was mentioned in the introduction is a focus on institutional culture. And I was thinking early on, when it came to African-American and Latino students in our K-12 schools, and mainly at the high school level. And at the time, there was a lot of attention on the dropout crisis. And I was wondering, if we could just focus on institutional culture, we might be able to prevent dropout and promote engagement and student success. And so I came up with this 10-point plan that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail today, but I encourage you to seek out my book, and there's articles on this topic as well. But I focused on a series of areas that I figured, if we can really hone in on some of these areas of school or institutional culture, we could actually create some positive change. And so some of those things include relationships, student voices that I mentioned earlier, community relevant pedagogy, where students actually learn about their local communities. And one of these areas is an interesting one, I thought, was listening to what I call the canaries in the classroom, listening to the students that are the most marginalized within the education system and asking, what can we learn from those students? How can those students' experiences actually inform policy and practice? And the last one that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is, this is really where my work on excellence was born. Over the last, this work on excellence campaigns evolved into its own kind of area of work. And I'm going to transition to that now. This work around excellence really encouraged me to work directly with communities and pull together groups of students, educators, and other community members to really define, what does excellence mean to our community, to the local community. And we would come together. I would help facilitate the process. We would define what excellence means, and we would make sure leadership was on board. And we would identify people in that local community, often using the school as a platform to define and reframe what excellence meant to that local community. So it could have been a student who was failing in school and ended up earning C's by the end of the quarter. And then by the next fall, they were on their way to landing on the honor roll. But it was also, excellence was also framed as students who were helping their communities, students who were improving, parents who were volunteering in schools, other community members who were just giving selflessly to help improve the school system, educators who were spending those extra hours serving students, tutoring students, creating programs, finding ways to engage parents. And I found that excellence was really defined locally and could be a real tool to help transform communities and change the narrative at the local level. And so I came up with this, the power of excellence framework, because I found out that, interestingly, once you start talking about excellence, it's contagious. People just really want to focus on that. And it does indeed help change the narrative to, in what ways are we struggling as a school system, to in what ways are we thriving? And how can we learn from those examples of ways that we're thriving? Learning from excellence is one lesson that came out of this work. Another one is that excellence is inherently additive. It really changes the way, changes the kind of framing of the conversation that we have when it comes to serving Latino students. The other one is excellence is politically viable. Who's going to say, no, we don't focus on excellence here? Just think about that. I also talk about excellence as a responsibility, that we have to own it. When we're living up to that definition of excellence, let's own it and let's learn from it and let's promote that. Excellence, this whole process that I just described also was this, it also signals that excellence can be embedded in the curriculum and the pedagogy. And really, a focus on excellence is a focus on equity, and a focus on excellence is a focus on social justice. And so I learned in my work that to make this all possible, leadership has to be on board, the community has to be on board. We have to understand that local context, and we should be focused on both the process of the work and the outcome of the work at the same time. So here's a question I've been asking in my most recent work that I've been engaging with since I've been at UC Riverside, and that is, how do Latino youth describe, define, and experience excellence in their homes, in their schools, and in their communities? And to engage in this work, and I'm hoping that this is helpful, some of you who have studied education, sociology, educational policy, or public policy may have come across some of these frameworks. And I like to focus on, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I encourage you to seek out some of these scholars like Laura Rendon, who talks about validation theory. It really gets us to think about, how are students validated in the classroom context? That every student's presence should be affirmed and validated. And she argues that a student should be validated within the first 6 weeks of school. Think about that, and what policies might be needed to make that happen. Funds of knowledge, Luis Moll and colleagues out of Arizona, they asked, what funds of knowledge do Latino students bring to the education space, even as elementary school students? And one way to find that is to center the students' voices, to send teachers out into the community, to have teachers do home visits, to really learn about the student's life beyond the classroom. That's one way we can tap into our students' funds of knowledge. Another one is pedagogies of the home. My colleague Dolores Delgado Bernal at Cal State LA, she's written about this topic for over 20 years. And she talks about this, the power that students learn, the skills and lessons and experiences they learn in their homes and in their communities that help them understand and resist injustices that they might face or inequalities that they see in their lives. And one lesson learned that I see that's relevant to policy and practice from this work is that student resilience is not an illness and resistance is not defiance. Really, we need to find ways to capitalize on students' home, family, and community experiences and really see those as sources of strength. And again, all of these frameworks that I'm reviewing here are really additive frameworks because they're flipping the dynamic and they're really shifting the narrative to say, how are Latino students actually wealthy or strong in the skills and the gifts and the experiences that they actually bring to school? And again, I would argue that this is what they bring in their backpacks. Community cultural wealth. My colleague at UC Riverside, Terry, also talks about this. She talks about these different forms of capital, and one of those is linguistic capital. We know a lot of our Latino students may know more than one language, more than one culture, more than one way of communicating. How can we capitalize on that in the classroom space? And finally, my own work in learning from a lot of these scholars that I've already mentioned, I came up with this framework called the praxis of recognition. And I ask, in what ways does the curriculum recognize our students? There are pedagogical approaches in the classroom, the ways in which we teach and learn, our understanding our context, understanding the possibilities that education could bring. And I argue in my framework that this is really about a holistic recognition of our students and the power that that brings. For this particular presentation, I want to hone in on one area of work that I've recently launched called the CREER project. It's called, it stands for Collaborative Research for Equity and Excellence in Our Schools. And we have been engaging our students in a series of kind of methodological and pedagogical approaches where we have our students tell their educational journeys. They learn about the history of educational inequality. We actually had a photo voice project where students took pictures with their phones or disposable cameras in their communities to capture what excellence looks like. And this photo voice methodology helps facilitate that. And so I'm going to share a little of our preliminary findings that help us understand how Latino students describe and understand excellence in their homes, schools, and communities. In this site where we were drawing our work is, I'll call it, it's a pseudonym, and we'll call it Aguirre High School. It's high school on the West Coast, over 2,000 students, 90% students socioeconomically disadvantaged, and 90% students, Latino students in the school. It was in the context of a 9th grade AVID class, and we'll call this teacher a pseudonym of Mrs. Alvarado, and we really honed in on a classroom of students. One of the things that I mentioned is that they told their educational journey, and not only did they tell their journey in terms of where they've been and where they're going, but we had them capture it in this kind of visual format. And we analyzed these really data-rich educational journeys, these kind of artifacts, and we found that group success is really facilitated by these AVID type programs, which some of you who are familiar with education know AVID is a program that's instituted to really promote college at the high school level across schools in California. And another key finding was that individual academic success was largely facilitated by their siblings who had experienced academic success, and other family members. However, what we also found was that separation and loss was a huge facilitator. Some of the students had significant disruptions in their educational journeys, whether that was because of issues of migration or immigration, family mobility, having to move because of work. And so those were also levers or facilitators of student success or challenges. Teacher support obviously was a huge facilitator, family, and movement. I call movimiento because a lot of our students spoke about the opportunity to visit schools, to visit colleges, and those being really significant in their own academic success. So those these are just some preliminary findings from our analysis of educational journeys that Latino students spoke about in terms of identifying excellence at school. The other thing that we had them do is going back to the Photo Voice project, where students actually took pictures. Students were told to take no more than 25 pictures and ultimately select 3 that captured excellence, one at home, one at school, and one in their community. And here's an example of a student talking about or capturing excellence in their social worlds. And one of them, this student talks about how this picture up on top gives off the impression of being lost, and I have to navigate around the place to find the correct path that will lead me to success. And he took a picture of kind of a forest area. Another student says, this is an important picture to me because it shows that in a small town in Mexico, people are still good and kind despite how people in the US paint them to be. And so this student, we'll call him Joan as a pseudonym, he talks about the power that this community plays in his life and how excellence is really exuded by he goes on in more data talking about the power of this community and the validation and the affirmation that this community provides to him, and really illuminating how excellence is not just present at school, but also in his community and the other spaces that he navigates. And some of the key findings that have come out of our overall analysis of Photo Voice projects have been the centricity of family, of community and family, this notion of owning or embracing excellence, and of course, academic excellence as well as being present. And students, I have data showing this similar data where you can visually see how students are making sense of excellence. And they took pictures of kind of soccer uniforms, band instruments, books, grades that they've received, and classrooms and other buildings on space, and that really capture and reflect what excellence means to them. Finally, we engage in this really interesting Loteria project, and this was inspired by a teacher, a professor and artist up north by the name of Dr. Luis Garcia. And he gave a presentation at UC Riverside a couple of years ago, and that inspired our research team to reimagine. Some of you may be familiar with the Loteria game, and it's a game of cards that often children play when they're young. And it has these images, these kind of sometimes cultural images, like the gentleman. And it'll have a picture of a man, and it'll have a number in the corner, and it'll say on the bottom, El Caballero, the gentleman. Well, we reimagined through the inspiration of Dr. Garcia's work, and we had the students construct their own Loteria cards based on excellence in their own lives. And this particular student drew a picture of a helmet, El Casco. And it's because when her dad goes to work, he has to wear this helmet for safety reasons. And it says use when working in case of falling or having an accident. And for this particular student, she was excited about this example of excellence because it's something that she sees every day in her life. And so I learned from this because I wonder, in what ways can we capitalize on this within the education context to validate and affirm what students experience in the home and who they see as models of excellence? And how can we validate that as a way to say, bring your entire identity, bring yourself, bring your language and your culture and your family into the classroom context so we can capitalize and learn and cultivate that. And so what we're seeing in terms of preliminary findings is seeing someone before them, like a sister, doing it, excelling in education, witnessing other people through their selfless efforts, making sacrifices for their families. In the academic literature, there's a lot of emphasis on this notion of familismo that Latino students bring. This really, the power that the family plays in inspiring students to want to excel in education. This notion of self-determination and this notion that of really having a clear consciousness of the other and of the community, having a consciousness and an awareness that there are people in their lives who are making sacrifices, and in turn, those become levers of inspiration for our students, motivation for our students. And those of you that are in the call, those of you that are involved in UC Sacramento, you may experience this or can attest to this as well, that a lot of us thrive in education and want to excel in education largely because of our families, to make our families proud and to pave the way for that next generation. And it's important that as educators, as policymakers, as leaders, that we kind of recognize that and center some of these lenses as we think about policy. So if we, as I kind of move to kind of moving downhill in my presentation, or to coming to the end of my presentation and revisiting this framework, if I think I added this column here to the right called policy implications. And, you know, just think about this. We've, in the Graduate School of Education on UC Riverside, when I welcome new students, I make it a point to say, you belong here, like explicitly telling our students, you belong here, we need you here, your families need you here, your community needs you here, and your ancestors need you here. Just think about what impact that would make on a student if every student in California heard those words coming from their teachers, heard those words coming from their school leadership. And we continue to affirm those kinds of things at home and in the community. Funds of knowledge. How can we develop student voice forums in schools and classrooms? How can we create a policy where all students in California have an opportunity to provide continuous feedback at the school level to teachers and other educators and leaders? How can we build a culture of knowledge co-construction in schools and classrooms, where students and teachers understand the power of co-constructing knowledge with students? And I think in teacher education programs are a perfect place to kind of model that for our future teachers, to kind of construct knowledge. Knowledge is not just something that we see in textbooks, but knowledge is something that we create. How can we create policies and resources to help cultivate that in our schools? In what ways are our students' community cultural wealth validated, and in what ways are they recognized in the school context? So as I think about clearing that smoke, right? If the goal is to get our students to see their brilliance, right? We know our students are brilliant, but are our schools set up in such a way, are our policies and practices set up in such a way to have our students see that brilliance of themselves, their families, their community, history, and ancestors? And I really see education, I try to capture this in this visual here, where I call it the purpose of education. And the purpose of education should be about who our students are, where they've been, and where are they going, right? This kind of 3-point framework that when we think about the purpose of education, and we're teaching students how to write, basic math skills, creating those foundation level skills, but also moving across the educational pipeline and thinking about learning about US history, learning about science and STEM topics, learning about computers. How can we keep these lenses central to the educational, really the purpose of who our students are, where they've been, and where they're going? And so here are some research-based practices and policies that we know help clear that smoke. If you notice, the smoke is gone. Remember from the initial visual that I shared, there was smoke here. In order to get rid of that smoke, we need to advocate for those equitable policies. We need that culturally relevant pedagogy, which is something that scholars have been talking about for 25 years. We need to engage in recognizing our students holistically, affirming their cultural language and history. All of these things clear that smoke. Scholars out of Harvard about 15 years ago talked about how it's not only vital to have high expectations, but we need to have high expectations joined with support. We need to really prioritize relationships. Imagine a policy that said every student should have a meaningful relationship with at least one adult, whether it's a teacher, a counselor, a mentor, a volunteer parent, someone who's able to work in the school setting. Imagine what a policy could look like. What if we were to dream of a policy that that require that of every single student across California. Let me just clear my screen here. Family engagement. Imagine more explicit policies that invested in the power that families bring to schools. Imagine schools, I've seen schools across my local area where there's actually a family engagement center. It's an actual space on campus. We know that those are affirming spaces because it invites families to campus and it actually engages them in really meaningful ways. Imagine a policy that we would enact and dedicate resources to ensuring that every single school across California, especially those serving historically marginalized students, had a family engagement center. This notion of learning over testing, we know that we need accountability measures to ensure that our students are moving in the right direction. But what if our efforts actually really honed in on a focus on learning and improvement and development versus just a focus on testing for the sake of testing? A focus on pedagogies of the home, cultural wealth. The assembly member mentioned his introduction, this real focus on ethnic studies. I think we're really close in California. And this is where the curriculum can help our students see the brilliance in their communities, see the brilliance in their history, see the brilliance in their ancestors. When our students can see themselves reflected in that curriculum, in their social worlds, in their lives, it inspires them. And there's empirical support to show that students are more likely to engage in school, improve academically, engage academically when they actually take ethnic studies courses. So we're excited about the direction that the state is taking, and it's affirmed and confirmed by the empirical research that's out there. Honoring student voices. Imagine if we developed a statewide policy that said every student should have the opportunity to share what they're learning, what's working well, and what needs to be improved. And I think a lot of this can be carried out at the local level. So all of these things that I just talked about are ways that we can help clear the smoke. They're policies and practices that we can advocate for to clear that smoke. So our students who are coming with that backpack full of gifts, it's affirmed at the school level, it's affirmed in education, and they can see their brilliance. Policy implications, and I just kind of addressed a lot of these, so I was a little ahead of myself. Every educator should demonstrate a commitment to equity, because we know our educators play a vital role. Especially, we saw that front and center this last year with the pandemic. Every educator should learn about additive frameworks, especially when serving communities of color, English learners, immigrant students, students with special needs, and others. Every student should see themselves in that curriculum mirror that I just mentioned. Every policy, I believe, should be vetted through an equity lens. We should ask ourselves, who's the most marginalized person or group of people in an institution? How will they experience this policy that we're thinking about? I think that could be a really profound way to vet future policy through the lens of equity. Every assessment effort should not just measure learning, but creativity, compassion, and progress. I'm working on a paper right now on what we should be measuring in light of the pandemic. And I really think that we should pivot and thinking about that creativity, that compassion, that progress we've made. Is challenging as the pandemic was, and as challenging as teaching and learning was for students across the entire educational pipeline. I think we've learned a lot, and there are lessons learned that that we could learn from moving forward. And finally, I think every Californian should know about excellent teachers, classrooms, and schools. We know there are models of excellence across the state, and we need opportunities to not just know that these models of excellence are present, but we need to know how this happened, what resources were needed, what practices were in place, what policies were in place to facilitate this excellence. So going back to this notion of the mirror, or in Spanish, the espejo, these are many of the things that students bring to the education context. Their culture, family, language, community, history. They bring their determination. They bring their resilience. they bring their ganas, right? This desire to want to learn more. And so the goal is really to get them to see themselves clearly in that mirror. And so right now, the current system is really set up for our students to see their brilliance largely academically. Their identity, our students' identity, is largely based on whether they are an A student, a C student, or they're failing, or they're getting a 4 or a 3 in this particular area on a standard. But I would argue that we need to move towards a system where we validate and legitimize our, I'm calling academic espejos, academic mirrors. That's what espejo means in Spanish, is mirror. And that I would argue that our students have multiple mirrors that make up their identity all at the same time. So their brilliance, academics being one of them, their sacrifice, their history, their community, their family, their culture. So these are all things that we need to affirm and recognize and be knowledge or aware of as we think about policy and practice. So as I conclude here, I would argue that education is, if this is our student, education should be about who our students are, who they were, and where they're going. So thank you, and I will end there.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to jump in while people are gathering their questions and just first say that I thought that was just a really brilliant talk and very much appreciated. I very much liked the emphasis on excellence. It reminded me a bit of a book I think that came out in the 1960s by the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who wrote a book of that title, Excellence. And he asked the question, can we be equal and excellent too? And his answer was a little bit guarded, but I think it could have benefited from this broader perspective of what excellence is that you brought to us in your remarks. I also appreciated the emphasis you made on relationships and connection. And I think that is something that's forgotten in our schools at all levels of education, including higher education. And finally, the broad framework really just is something that we don't see very often. It's really a tool that's going to help us to think about some of these complex issues. I wonder, though, if you could comment on two things. One is whether this idea of excellence can be extended to technical and vocational education, not just for members of minoritized groups, but really for everyone, because there's different definitions of excellence, and it doesn't just mean scoring well on multiple choice tests, as you pointed out, right? And then also, how might this apply to specifically to students who might be encouraged to pursue STEM fields? Because I think that's something that we really need, is for Latinx students as well as others to think about these careers for the future.
Absolutely. Great question about the kind of technical and vocational students and the STEM students. I mean, I think that the answer would be the same, in that they're all important. And I think what this excellence focus does is it says our students need to see models of excellence for them to kind of realize what it looks like. So whether it's in vocational, technical, let's show them what models of excellence look like in that area. If that's an area they are interested in pursuing, let's show them, let's introduce them to people in models that shaped their pathways to enter those fields. I think people can connect with story. People can connect with autobiography and narrative often, or biography. I know when I go to talks, I often remember the story that the speaker told as a way to just kind of jog my own memory about what they spoke about. But often we connect on a human level with story. And I would say with the STEM areas, I think students who have historically been left out of the STEM areas need to see others like them who have pursued that area and have succeeded. And at the same time, I think we really need to be more intentional about creating policies and programs. And I know there's a lot of good work happening around the country to promote STEM. Our Graduate School of Education as well, we're trying to promote and encourage people to become STEM teachers and work with our campus partners to identify physics teachers and biology teachers and chemistry teachers and math teachers because we need people who know their content and could connect with students, right? And share that context. So I think the same would be said about the STEM students, is that showing them what excellence, what possibilities look like, and identifying intentional policies and practices to facilitate student success, especially historically marginalized and minoritized students who have been left out of those opportunities.
Thank you. I think
Great. Thank you so
our
much,
staff
Dean
will-
Rodriguez. Yeah, for a fantastic talk. And I'm just going to give Brooke a second here to just go ahead and stop the recording.